Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the weekly lecture. I appreciate you watching it retroactively, and for those who can be with us, we're going to talk about ancient Rome today. And so this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. There's so much to it that I divided it into two presentations, and so this is part one, and we'll make it through this today. It's going to be a little bit lengthy, so feel free if you want to pause the video, get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and just kind of hang out. It's entertaining and engaging topics. So, and we've got 74 slides. We'll make it through them a little bit more quickly than you might imagine, but it will take a little bit of time. So I appreciate you hanging out with us. So, what comes to mind when you think of ancient Rome? You know, last week we talked about Greece. We talk about the legacies from Greece. Ancient Rome is even larger and impacts world history on an even bigger scale. And so you probably have some ideas of what you might think of when you hear the term ancient Rome, the Colosseum here, of course. But what about what represents quintessential Roman culture? You've got a Roman bath here, of course, gladiators, Roman gladiators, togas. What about the emperors? And so that's actually on part two. I won't get into the emperors today, but I'll post a second video if you would like to go back and watch it. You can. And the emperors is a very fascinating time in Roman history. So in terms of geography, you probably are aware that Rome is in Italy and is on the west side today. You can see it here, kind of in between Florence and Naples. And so the Etruscans are sort of the founders of Rome. They lived north of the current location and they dominated the Latin people. They brought in novel cultural ideas. They were skilled with leatherworking and street paving. One of the most essential scientific technologies that came from Rome is concrete. And so the Etruscans were the earliest organized people group who lived on the Italian peninsula during the Iron Age. Now, they made homes of wattle and daub. If you've ever been to Etowah Indian Mounds in Cartersville, it does look kind of similar to the little thatched roof home that they have out for viewing. Now, the custom of making a wish on a wishbone is derived from the Etruscans. That's kind of a fun fact. They believed that hens were prophetic and could tell the future because they cackled when they laid an egg. And so one of the most prominent historians is Mary Beard. She wrote a book called SPQR, and I encourage you to read it. You can find it for free online in a couple places, such as some internet libraries. I believe we have it for free in the GHC library. And if you've never gone into the GHC library, there are numerous resources, ebooks that you can get for free. I encourage you to check it out. You can access it via the homepage on D2L. So, but SPQR stands for Senate Populusque Romanus. And so the Senate and the people of Rome, basically, it was common to see the letters SPQR in ancient Rome. They stand for unity between the political structure and the common man. And so if you're looking for legacies, again, we got democracy from Greece, we get our republic from Rome. And so here you see this concept of the common people being involved in governmental affairs. And this is happening in the ancient world, right? This isn't just something that flowed out of the Enlightenment that became real in the age of revolution, the age of democracy. This is something that was happening in Rome and Greece. And so the coin that you see here is a silver denarius. The woman is the goddess Diana. She holds a torch in her right hand because she is the goddess of light. And so that's another essential. There wasn't a whole lot of separation of church and state in ancient times, whereas, in America, that is essential to the foundations of our country. Thomas Jefferson was one of the ones who coined that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, when he wrote to the Danbury Baptist. But back in ancient times, it was very common to have a theocracy. And so you have progressive ideas here, such as unity between political structure and the common man, but you also have the archaic unit of this theological political structure as well. And so it's important to know some of these historians who wrote about ancient Rome at the time that they lived it or close to that time. Livy is one of them. And so he probably came from an affluent family. He's very well educated. He was never involved in government. And so, these people's experience, it's going to impact how they write about the country. And so as I go through various historians and biographers, you'll kind of see the different angles, and so you put all those together, you can get an excellent picture of ancient Rome. But yeah, he wasn't involved in government. His writings show a margin of error when he discusses political and military matters, but there's a lot of value that we can glean from him as well. So, historiography is the term of the way historians write about history. So, perspectives, right? It's a really fancy way to say that we're going to get a lot of perspectives on history from various people. And so, you have Crispus, who's better known as Sallust. He's an excellent source. He offered an analysis of the corruption. He regrets the vanishing old Rome. And he said that few emperors wrote history or had it written for them. So Claudius, Vespasian, and Hadrian were a few. And again, I'm getting more into the second part of this, but just kind of tuck that name away, Sallust. And so, in terms of historiography, you have a lot of themes of decadence, which really boils down to patriotism, right? So, if you're a patriot, you write well about your country. And so, Roman historiography remained consistently focused on the story of Rome, a city and a state more and more viewed as eternal. And so, and this is from a book called Historiography, Ancient, Medieval, and Modern, if you want to check it out. But they basically say that old Rome, a state marked by individual excellence and social harmony, had decayed because of a deterioration in public morality and civic spirit. Tacitus did not agree with Polybius' assertion that its peculiar mixed form of government had helped Rome to achieve a long-lasting stability. Polybius's view was too theoretical for Tacitus, who maintained that excellence of leadership, dutiful service by the mass of the citizens, and a generally austere lifestyle, rather than any particular form of government, had lifted Rome into greatness. When the power of Rome brought the curse of wealth, it destroyed the civic virtue, and then rampant luxury, greed, and ambition corrupted the leaders and transformed the citizens into subjects who bear neither full servitude nor freedom. And so that's a really essential question to answer. Why did Rome fall? Right. And so I really answer that when we get down to the end of the second PowerPoint. But in a nutshell, I would say that Rome was weakened from within, and then it couldn't stand the pressures from without, right? You had all these loosely organized tribes that became very large, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Huns, people like that, and Rome just wasn't unified enough to fight against them, and so it fell. You also have other factors. I mean, there's a lot of smaller factors and all that: taxes, slavery, citizenship, unemployment. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you want a really clear, concise answer that's simple, they were weakened from within and couldn't withstand the pressures from without. But we're talking about origins. So everybody's always very interested in how Rome fell. But let's talk about how Rome started. And so you may have heard the story of Romulus and Remus. And so to understand the Romans, Mary Beard says, it is necessary to understand where they believe they came from and to think through the significance of the story of Romulus and Remus. So there are these twins, right? They're set afloat. It's almost like the story of Moses in the Bible. They're set afloat down a river. They end up being fed by this she-wolf, which you see here, and one of them kills the other, and so Romulus becomes the first, quote, king of Rome, and that supposedly is how they started. Now, there's another story, which you may be less familiar with. Aeneas is a legend firmly embedded in Roman history. I won't go into too much of that. You can pause and read if you wish. But the story of Romulus and Remus is pretty accepted by scholars. Some scholars have even likened it to the story of Cain and Abel. So you kind of can see the biblical connotations in some of that, in terms of, like, if you know the story of Moses setting someone down the river in a basket. Of course, it was just one, not two. So there are fundamental differences as well, but some very interesting similarities. And so, according to Livy, after Romulus killed Remus, he invited the neighboring people from around the area, so this is known as Latium, to enjoy a religious festival. And in the middle of it, he gave his men a signal to abduct young women from among the visitors and carry them off as wives. And so this became a great debate for Roman writers. Livy tries to defend the early Romans, saying that they only kidnapped unmarried women for the purpose of marriage, and he argues that this was necessary for the success of the country. The poet Ovid takes the story to a new level. He says that the Romans were trying to spot the girl they would marry. So we're not really sure what happened, but it's kind of hard to make that story look good. So other perspectives from Mary Beard. Whatever the case, these stories tell us something about how the Romans understood their city as well as their values and customs. It's impossible to construct a coherent narrative about either Romulus or Aeneas, and it's extremely difficult to pin precise dates onto the earliest phases of Roman history. However, we can get a general idea of how the city developed and enjoy specific glimpses into the world of the ancient Romans. So, Roman slavery in some ways was as brutal as Roman methods of military conquest. However, it was not necessarily a life sentence. So, slavery in the ancient world is very different than how we sort of tend to interpret slavery. I think there's this idea that everything is like antebellum American slavery. So antebellum means before the war. American slavery before the Civil War, everything didn't look like that. Slavery really changed in the 1500s with the age of exploration, although some points were the same, but basically slaves were usually prisoners of war in ancient times. And in ancient times, they could receive their freedom. Sometimes they could buy it with cash, which also happened in the antebellum period, but was less common. And the contrast with classical Athens is striking. So, very few slaves were freed in Athens, and slaves did not gain citizenship typically. Now, slavery was an accepted fact in the ancient world and a significant factor in economic and societal life. They were frequently the product of defeat in wars. As I said, the sale of slaves became a cornerstone of business in the Greco Roman world. And so Dr. William Nigel Kerr states that the state of a slave varied. Some were impressed into gangs and they worked in fields and mines, and others were highly skilled workers and trusted administrators. Some of them were even tutors. Frequently, slaves in the ancient world were far better off than free laborers. And I think I mentioned this in the last presentation. The technology just was not advanced in the ancient world. And there is a question of whether could people have really survived given the state of technology you needed, especially in an urban area? Remember, we talked about that too. Slavery really grew in urban areas, not in densely populated places. And so there's a question of with urbanization, could they have even survived without the use of slave labor to grow crops and things like that? And so Roman laws were passed to protect slaves and allow rights, even of private possessions. And sometimes they were used to ransom a slave and his family. Now, by the first century, the slave population had grown so large in the Roman world that it created problems. You have uprisings, which we'll talk about in just a minute. If a slave attacked an owner, every slave in the household was killed. So that was a deterrent from bad behavior, quote. In 136 BC, some 70,000 slaves in Sicily withstood Rome for 4 years. So, with that under your belt, kind of go back and think about the kings of Rome. So you have several different kings. Interestingly, Mary Beard notes that they lived unusually long lives, which also has this sort of bizarre connection to the Bible. If you know much about pre-flood, the antediluvian period, people lived extremely long lives in the Bible. And so you have this recording of these kings with these long lifespans. And also that appears on Babylonian script as well. There's some kind of inscription on a rock. I'll have to look up the name of it. But they also in the Babylonian, they lived for thousands of years up until a certain point in history. So But Rome under the king, so the Romans essentially became a blend of Latins and Etruscans. The Latins were from the east, the Etruscans were from the north. And at one point, three Etruscan kings consecutively ruled over Rome. To create a better society, the people formed the Roman Republic. And so here you kind of get into the beginning of political structure as we know it today. They had two rulers instead of one, so almost like a prime minister and a president in a way. In America, we just know the one president, but there are political structures in the world today that offer two. And so these people in ancient Rome are called consuls, and one consul could override the decisions of the other. So this meant that big decisions would not pass unless two leaders agreed on them. Now, the Romans also controlled the consuls by appointing men to a senate. They represented the people. They advised consuls on how Rome should be managed. Now, and some differences in our political structure and theirs. Membership in the Senate in ancient Rome was for life. The Senate had a large age range with both young men and elders. They worked together, and there was sort of this implied hierarchy. So the elders wrote more of the laws. There was a power structure. The younger members were lower in status. And voting was done by walking over to the person whose position you supported. Now, unlike other class societies, Rome only had a few divisions. The main ones were patricians and plebeians, and so that's the upper and lower classes, respectively. And in the early days, only the patricians could serve as senators. They often did not represent the plebeians fairly, and it took about roughly 300 years for the plebeians to gain fair representation. So, in the same way that American democracy expanded over time, because if you know anything about that, you have like property rights. It was only property owning males, white males, who could vote in early American society. And over time, democracy expanded. Interestingly, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. And so, the Civil War, the Civil War fueled the women's suffrage movement in a lot of ways. And so you kind of see the same thing here. Luckily, it didn't take 300 years for that to happen in America, but it took quite a while. And so that brings us to Hannibal and the Punic Wars. So you've got 218 to 146 BC. Now, the Romans used the word Punic for the Phoenicians. They settled the city of Carthage. And so this was sort of like colonization of ancient times. And Polybius, the Greek historian, he was critical of many Roman historians. He said their subjects are simple and without complications. They seek name and reputation of historians, not from truth and facts, but the number of their books, and accordingly, they are obliged to give petty affairs an air of importance. So, in other words, they focused on things that he thought were very unimportant, and he wanted to see some of these Roman historians focus on other topics. He says the Greco-Roman historians, in the narrow sense of the term, namely those who wrote Roman history in Greek, were of second rank compared to Fabius Pictor and Alimentus. The exception was Polybius, a native of Megalopolis, who became the greatest of the Greco-Roman historians. So his histories represent a report on Rome's past by an outsider who could observe Roman government, military, arts, and diplomacy from an extremely favorable position. Polybius thought that history should be told for the purpose of education about life rather than for entertainment value. So sort of like compare this to today's historical drama that you watch on TV versus a documentary, right? In written form, though, it's two totally different angles of how to tell history. And so this caused him to present Roman hegemony in a way that the Greeks hated to do. However, his histories were not comprehensive. And so during the First Punic War, the Carthaginians fought the Romans over the island of Sicily. And that's, if Italy's the boot, it's kicking Sicily. And so roughly 20 years later, a brilliant general, Hannibal, rose to power in Carthage. When he was a boy, he developed an intense hatred for Rome because his father asked him to take an oath that he would never befriend them. And so one of the cleverest ways he displayed his hatred was in his surprise attack. And so you can kind of see here, if you live in Carthage, which is about right here where it says Africa, Sicily is just right across the Mediterranean Sea. So the obvious way to attack would be by boat, right? You just sail right across, but that they would probably be waiting for you. They have plenty of guards there. The less obvious way would be to go into Spain and go over the mountains and several mountains. You got the Pyrenees Mountains, and then you have the Swiss Alps. Very difficult method, but you could certainly surprise them that way. And so that's what Hannibal decided to do. This is what the Swiss Alps look like. Now imagine having to climb that with your army, and not just with your army, but with a lot of elephants as well. He took 37 elephants with him, and Mary Beard states that this was more for propaganda than as a practical military asset. The Romans saw the elephants as symbols of victory and eternity. And so all but one elephant died on the journey due to freezing conditions or falling to their death on those treacherous mountains. And so, just like the elephants, nearly 1/3 of Hannibal's men also perished along the way. In spite of this, Hannibal fought bravely for the next 15 years. He defeated the Romans, but their expertise finally caught up to him. The Roman general Scipio fought Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, and this gave the Romans the final victory. And I'm going to skip the Mary Beard. Your assignment this week is to watch an episode of Mary Beard about Meet the Romans. So I hope you guys enjoy that. She is a fantastic storyteller. So in ancient Rome, slaves were sometimes used as gladiators. So moving on now, going back to slavery a little bit, but trying to contextualize this with the timeline, we're in 71 BC now. So if you've ever seen Spartacus, which is a fun movie. I love old movies, in case you can't tell. I've mentioned a couple in last week's presentation. I think I talked about Cleopatra and Jason and the Argonauts. Those are fun. Spartacus is fun. So anyway, so the term gladiator comes from the Latin word gladius, which means sword. And a gladiator was trained to use the sword and other weapons to fight to the death against other gladiators. So the largest slave uprising was led by Spartacus. He's a slave from Thrace. He was a free man, but was a captive of war. The historian Plutarch wrote an account of Spartacus. He was a Greek historian who focused mostly on biography. So again, kind of think about these various types of history. Let's go back through them. You've got a documentary. You can tell it from a military standpoint, a political standpoint. You can tell it for entertainment value, or you can focus on someone's life as a biography. Many, many different ways to tell history. And so his most notable work was called Parallel Lives, and this compared the Greeks to the Romans. And biography was very common in the ancient world, and even the ancients recognized the difference between biography and history. Plutarch said, if I do not record all of their most celebrated achievements or describe any of them, talking about famous people, exhaustively, but merely summarize for the most part what they accomplished, I ask my readers not to regard this as fault, for I am writing biography, not history. And the truth is that the most brilliant exploits often tell us nothing about the virtues or vices of men who perform them, while on the other hand, a chance remark or joke may reveal far more of a man's character than the mere feat of winning battles in which thousands fall. And there's a lot of truth in that today as well. You know, think about our modern day sports players or actors. We love them on the screen, right? And we love to go to the game and watch them play. But at the end of the day, who are they really? And what sort of people, you know, what sort of character do they actually have? It's two different things, right? And so Spartacus, going back to Spartacus, so we're kind of highlighting the historians who record these stories. And so it was Spartacus who was while he was in gladiator school that he first managed to escape slavery. So imagine being a slave put in gladiator school. That had to be epic. Well, after setting thousands of slaves free, he formed a huge army that he was able to fight off the Romans with for nearly 2 years. And this was called the Servile War. So in 71 BC, Crassus and his enemy met up with Spartacus and his army of 90,000 men, so he was quite successful. And Plutarch wrote that in full view, Spartacus stood bravely next to his own horse. He struck the horse with a sword and killed it because he claimed that if they lost that day, he wouldn't need it anymore. And if they won, he would get a new one. So I feel bad for that horse. I love horses. But fun fact, this photo that you see is from the Carlos Museum. So if you want to take a trip down there to Atlanta at Emory, you can see Roman armor. And this particular piece is kind of cool because it's actually been pierced with an arrow. And if you look at it very closely, I think it was in the backside, if I'm not mistaken. So literally shot in the back with an arrow. But that's kind of a fun thing. And then you've got some red figure pottery and other artifacts around it as well. And so, but you probably want to know what happened to Spartacus, right? I left you hanging. So the Roman army, nearly the entire group of slaves that day, including Spartacus, they were all killed by the Roman army. And 6,000 surviving slaves were crucified. They were lined up for miles along the Appian Way, which was a famous road in Rome. So this is a picture of the Appian Way. Imagine what it must have looked like at that time. So that brings us to the first triumvirate. And so the word triumvirate means rule by the persons or parties. And during the first triumvirate, the leadership of Rome was contested by Marcus Crassus, Pompey the Great, and Julius Caesar. And so in addition to defending Spartacus, Crassus served Rome as a consul and a censor. A censor was a person who watched the conduct of the Senate, and so they did have some sort of overseer, and that's where the modern word is derived from. Now, Pompey the Great was also a consul, and he was well admired for fighting pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. Yes, there were pirates at that time. And so Julius Caesar was a brilliant man on many levels. I'm sure you've heard of him. He was born in Rome, but studied in Greece. And before he was elected consul, he served Rome as the director of public works and games. Now, as you can imagine, that made him very popular because he spent an exorbitant amount of money on entertainment. And so it put the country in a little bit of debt, but the people didn't care because they were having fun. And so Julius Caesar also furthered his career by serving as a military general. He went on to the land of Gaul, which is France today, and fought practically undefeated for about 9 years. And eventually, through bribes and violence, Caesar encouraged Pompey and Crassus to join a coalition with him, and this changed the two-leader policy to three, creating the first, quote, triumvirate. Now, eventually, the Romans began to fear Julius Caesar, and at one point, when he was ready to return home, he was told by the Roman Senate not to show up with his army. It would be seen as an act of war, and so he could return home as a private citizen, but not as a general. And so this leads to that famous phrase, the die is cast. And so at the time of the mandate, Caesar was near the Rubicon, which was a stream that ran along the border of Gaul and Italy. Remember, Gaul is France. And so if he crossed, he would essentially have declared war against Rome. And so that's why he said that famous phrase, the die is cast. And many historians say that he went ahead and crossed without a second thought. Now, Mary Beard has a different interpretation of this. She says that sometime around January in 49 BC, Julius Caesar, with just one of his regions from Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, the river that marked the boundary of northern Italy. And the exact date is not known, nor even the location. It wasn't even really a river. It was more like a small brook than a raging torrent of popular imagination. And so, according to one of his companions on the journey, Pollio, the historian, senator, and founder of Rome's first public library, said that when he finally approached the Rubicon after some hesitation, Caesar quoted in Greek 2 words from the Athenian comic playwright Menander, literally a phrase borrowed from gambling, let the die be thrown. Now, despite the English translation, the die is cast, which again appears to hint at the irrevocable step being taken, and you think about the difference in those two phrases. Let the dice be thrown. Doesn't really indicate a decisive conclusion. The die is cast is much more authoritative, right? And so Mary Beard gets a lot of heat for this. And when you write your review, you talk about her video that you're watching this week. Really look for these kind of details. This is what I'm looking for in your work. There's a lot of critique of Mary Beard. Some people disagree with the way she tells Roman history. Some have said she has a tendency to underplay important cultural events. She dresses down the decisiveness of Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon, informing us that he is more likely to say, let the dice be thrown than the die is cast. The Battle of Actium, the site of Octavian's clinching victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, isn't a grand battle at all, according to Mary Beard, but rather a low-key, slightly tawdry affair. And so, like I said, kind of look for things like this. You'll see varying views on certain historical events that really change the way that we see them. And so the outcome, basically, though, Caesar's defiant act was so threatening to Pompey that he ran from Rome. His wife, who was Caesar's daughter, Julia, she had died in childbirth, and so that relationship was strained. And Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by Ptolemy's advisors. And his absence left a vacancy in the Roman government that Caesar easily filled. So Caesar's ascent to power was a turning point in Roman history. Even though he was ruthless towards his enemies, he actually provided good care for the citizens of Rome. He implemented positive changes to Roman society, such as provisions of grain for the poor. And so you talk about a welfare state, kind of look into that. What is the modern welfare state? How has welfare evolved through the ages? Because it's very controversial as to how much support we should provide and whose job is it, especially in American society. Is that the church's job? Is that the government's job? And historically in ancient Roman Greece, whose job was it? So, but Caesar implemented positive changes. He wrote extensively about his accomplishments in Gaul in a work called Seven Commentaries on the Gallic War. And so one of Caesar's major downfalls was his relationship with Cleopatra. Caesar was already married when he met Cleopatra and helped her obtain the throne of Egypt. And in spite of this, they really did make a powerful couple. They were both intelligent and ambitious people. And eventually, Caesar began spending more time in Egypt than in Rome, which caused the Romans to have some mixed feelings about him. They wondered where his loyalties actually were. And so Caesar never called himself a king. Instead, he gave himself the title dictator for life. He also enjoyed the term imperator, which was how the Roman army addressed him. That is where the word emperor came from. And on March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Julius Caesar was assassinated as he casually strolled into a Senate meeting. The death of Julius Caesar ushered in the third triumvirate. And so this time, the three men vying for leadership were Gaius Octavian, Marcus Lepidus, and Mark Antony. And so Octavian was only 18 years old at the time. He was the great nephew of Julius Caesar and also Caesar's adopted son. Now, as revenge for Caesar's death, he had the two men who were responsible for the assassination murdered, and he then hoped to restore order to the Roman world with the help of Antony and Lepidus. Octavian and Mark Antony could not agree on how to govern Rome, and so this was awkward. For one thing, Mark Antony married Octavian's sister, and in much the same way that Julius Caesar and Pompey were in-laws, Mark Antony and Octavian were as well. Lepidus retired from his position early on, leaving Octavian and Mark Antony to fight over their differences. And at one point, they simply divided the Roman Republic. Octavian took the west, Mark Antony took the east, and Antony's division included Egypt, which led to his relationship with Cleopatra. And so then interesting Herod the Great. So Herod was an interesting character because his mother was an Arabian princess and his father was from Judea. You might recognize his name from the Bible if you happen to have read it. He was around at the time of Christ. And so with permission from Octavian and Mark Antony, Herod was able to rule Palestine for about 34 years. He was very evil. He murdered many members of his own family, and one of his major accomplishments was the restoration of the Jewish temple. The Wailing Wall, where many people go to pray today, is the last wall that remains of the temple that Herod built. Here's a replica of what his temple probably looked like. And here's the Wailing Wall today. So many people will put prayers in it. It's seen as a very symbolic place. So that brings us to the Battle of Actium. And so as Herod worked to establish Palestine, the third triumvirate began to fall apart. And after the division of the empire, Mark Antony and Octavian failed to trust each other. Octavian attempted to sully Mark Antony's reputation, and Octavian tried to make the Romans think that it was a betrayal to Rome to marry an Egyptian queen. And so this was pretty easy to do because Mark Antony had attended some Roman festivals wearing Egyptian clothes. Uh-oh. And so Octavian also told the Romans that Cleopatra wanted full dominance in Rome. By the fall of 33 BC, Octavian formally declared war against Mark Antony, and this was basically civil war in Rome. Now, the actual battle was fought at sea, and all three leaders met on the water with their naval fleet, which you can see in this relief here. Now, Octavian's ships overtook Mark Antony, and Cleopatra sort of panicked. You know, women don't go to war. Historically speaking, when you look at women rulers like those in Egypt, like Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, they work on economics. You know, typically women build trade routes. They do all sorts of peaceful things. They build relations with their neighbors. But you know, really, women typically don't lead armies into battle. And this is just a great example as to why. So she sort of panicked. You know, she brought her 60 ships in, then she fled in despair. And Mark Antony realized that she had abandoned him. And so this caused his men to criticize him. And the decision proved to be the conclusion of his reign. Now, after the battle, Octavian hunted both Mark Antony and Cleopatra down, and the story reads almost like a Romeo and Juliet. Cleopatra thought Mark Antony was dead, and so she tried to commit suicide with a poisonous snake, and Mark Antony committed suicide by stabbing himself with his sword, and eventually the pair died in each other's arms. Very tragic. In much the same way that they lived dramatic lives, the pair also died a dramatic death. And so, with Mark Antony gone, Octavian was able to easily rule Rome. He avoided the title of king or dictator and instead called himself Augustus, which means exalted one. And in respect for Julius Caesar, he maintained the name, and his full title was Augustus Caesar. And so, those who knew him personally, he liked to be addressed as princeps or first citizen. Octavian was very friendly with the Roman senators and they respected his leadership. He worked on many construction projects such as bathhouses, aqueducts, and theaters. And it was under Octavian that Rome experienced what was called the Pax Romana or Roman peace. And so that brings us to the conclusion of Ancient Rome Part 1. I hope you enjoyed this overview. Ancient Rome, like I said, is just a fascinating place to study. And if you think this was interesting, wait till we get to Part 2 and we talk about the Roman emperors. There's even more to come. So I hope